When we live in a house, we're just passing through. People have occupied it before us, and others will take our place when we leave. 100 human dramas played out in every room. In this series, I'm going back in time to uncover the secret life of a single house, a Georgian terrace here in Newcastle on Tyneside, where I grew up. Newcastle's changing fortunes have seen it transformed. From a coal-fired city of innovation and industry to a cultural powerhouse with its own unique character. In many ways, number 5 Ravensworth Terrace is an ordinary house. But, as I'll show you, in reality, it's an amazing treasure trove. Delving into the archives, I'm going to use the personal histories of the residents of this house to uncover an epic story that spans 2 centuries. We found this incredible piece of evidence.
Yeah, I do remember.
You okay? Yeah. It's a report of a theft from this house. He was convinced that this was the spirit of his deceased daughter. And here on the corner is our house. A fearful stab in the back part of his head. This was obviously a case that scandalized Newcastle. This is the ultimate detective hunt, uncovering lives that weren't recorded in the history books, but through which we can tell a new version of our nation's past, an alternative history of Britain from within the walls of a single house. This is number 5 Ravensworth Terrace, built in the 1820s away from the smog and dirt of the industries along the River Tyne. We last left the house in 1859, when workhouse doctor Nicholas Hardcastle moved out and his mother-in-law, Mary Colbeck, moved in. The 1861 census tells us she's not living here alone. Here we have Mary Colbeck. She's 65 years old and she's living here with a servant, Alice Robinson, and with her grandson, James Todd, who's just 13. With 10 rooms spread over 5 floors, this was a large house for so few people. Especially as the census also tells us that 2 of the houses next door were each home to 10 people. With James probably at the local school, Mary would have spent her days in the living areas on the first 2 floors, while Alice would have spent hers running between the kitchen in the basement and her bedroom in the attic. So this is an unusual setup, and it's one that raises lots of questions, the most obvious of which is, has something happened to James's parents, and does that explain why he's living here with his grandmother? Just the 2 of them and Alice the servant rattling around in this big 4-storey townhouse. To answer this question, we first need to find out who Mary Colbeck and James Todd are. If we peel back 10 years to the 1851 census, we see that Mary Colbeck is a widow and the mother of 3 daughters. She is living on an estate called Walton Hall on the outskirts of Newcastle with a governess and 4 servants. Other documents show that Mary also owns 3 farms of nearly 400 acres and that the family fortune was worth £16,000, around £1.5 million in today's money. So to put all of this into perspective, the Colbecks aren't staggeringly wealthy. They're not aristocrats, but they are part of the landed gentry. These are people who are able to live very comfortably from the profits they get from their property, which makes them far wealthier than the vast majority of people. So the presumption has to be that Mary has handed over the running of Walton Hall to her daughters and she's moved to Ravensworth Terrace to retire. So what about Mary's grandson, James Todd? At the time he's living with Mary, he's the eldest of 8 children. His mother is Margaret Ann Todd, Mary Colbeck's eldest daughter. And his father is Frederick Swan Todd, the son of a local timber merchant. From other documents, we can see that along with his 3 brothers, Frederick had inherited an estate worth £7,000. It included 2 glassmaking factories by the River Tyne and a family mansion in the centre of town. What all of this is telling us is that the 2 residents of this house, Mary Colbeck and her grandson, James Todd, both came from well-established Newcastle families. In the Colbecks, we have a dynasty of landowners run by the Matriarch Mary and her 3 daughters. And in the Todds, a family of industrialists with 4 sons. So the marriage of Mary Colbeck's eldest daughter, Margaret, to Frederick Todd is a perfect match that brings these 2 wealthy families together. But why isn't James living with his mother and father and 7 siblings? The answer might lie in the Todd family business. So to find out more about it, I've come to meet Dr. Cathy Ross on the banks of the River Tyne. So we know the Todds are wealthy and we know that they're working in the glass industry. Are they big players?
Yes, they are. They're bottle manufacturers and they have 2 quite important bottle-making sites. One's a little down the river towards Shields at St Lawrence, and the other one's just over there in the Close Gate, and that's quite an old site, one of the earliest sites of glassmaking on Tyneside. We have a little billhead from the 1820s which shows you very clearly the 2 bottle cones, and that's the chimneys within which the bottle makers would be working.
When the Todds bought into the business in the 1820s, glassmaking was Newcastle's 2nd largest industry after coal. At the time, there were 31 glassworks operating on Tyneside, making 40% of English glass. The Todds would have employed teams of workers, some as young as 12, to hand make their bottles in the intense heat of the bottle cones. They made their profits through bulk production, shipping their glass all over the world. Do we know how extensive the Close Gates glassworks were?
We have a notice here which gives you quite a good description of the works.
This is from 1859.
It says it's got 2 excellent cones capable of producing 200,000 dozen a year.
About 2.5 million bottles a year.
Oh, yes. A river frontage of 334 feet, a frontage which is seldom to be met with on the Tyne.
So this is prime industrial real estate right on one of the most important rivers and one of the most important industrial towns in the most industrialised nation in the world.
Exactly, yes.
So this is worth something.
Yes, location. It's got a good location in that sense.
I mean, this is a really impressive description of the plant and all its equipment, but I can't help noticing it's also a bill for sale. So why were the Todds selling the business? Were they cashing in, or had something gone wrong? And might this explain why Mary Colbeck is looking after her grandson at Ravensworth Terrace? Scouring the newspaper archives for the Todd name, I think I found the answer. I've discovered numerous reports that implicate James's father Frederick in a sensational case that scandalised Newcastle and became national news. On the evening, 10 o'clock at night, of the 24th of March, 1858, Frederick Todd arrives at the office of George Talentyre Gibson. Now, he is one of the wealthiest, most respected solicitors in Newcastle, and Frederick has brought his wife, Margaret, with him. That's the eldest daughter of Mary Colbeck. These reports variously describe Frederick as being anxious or agitated, and he demands to have a meeting with Gibson. He's eventually ushered into his office. He arrives holding his hat. Gibson says, "Wait a minute or 2, I will speak with you, but I must finish a letter to catch the post." Then out of the corner of his eye, he sees something like a knife glistening in Frederick's hand. At that point, he raises his arms to defend himself, and then he receives a fearful stab in the back part of his head. The stab, it is alleged, if it had been struck an inch lower down, would have killed Mr. Gibson on the spot. At that point, Frederick shouts, "I'll kill you, I'll kill you." He starts holding Gibson with his left hand and he's stabbing him with his right. Gibson shouts out and the clerks rush to help him. The knife is described as a common dessert knife, anything but sharp, but it's being used with deadly force. And then Margaret walks in and screams, "Freddie, Freddie, what have you done?" And what followed was just as dramatic. Eventually, 2 policemen arrive on the scene. They overpower and they arrest Frederick. Then, when they have him in custody, they notice a second knife, a pocket knife of several blades, and it's open in his hands. And they also notice that he is endeavouring to unloosen his neckerchief. He's trying to cut his own throat. 4 months later, Frederick was tried at Newcastle Assizes. From the court documents, the motives for his desperate act become crystal clear. What lay behind this attempted murder, this attempted suicide, was money. It turns out that Frederick was £60,000 to £70,000 in debt. That is tens of millions of pounds in today's money, and his creditors had already begun to close in on him. His Scottish creditors had seized the St. Lawrence Bottle Works, and Mr. Gibson had seized the Close Gate Works and begun to sell off his stock. That was 2 days before the attack. To explain his enormous debt, Frederick testified that he'd become insolvent in the global financial crash of 1857. And that had been just the first in a long line of financial troubles that had started with the death of his father a decade earlier.
When Frederick Todd had inherited his father's glassworks, was that a good time to be getting into the glass industry?
Well, he couldn't have picked a worse time, actually, because what happens in 1845 is that the customs tax on imported glass is lifted. And that means foreign manufacturers who've been developing more innovative ways of manufacturing can now import cheap glass into the UK. The really bright ones start putting more machinery in, using gas-fired furnaces rather than coal-fired furnaces, and they zoom ahead, whereas the people who don't modernise have to cope with falling prices.
And which of those camps did the Todds fall into?
Well, it looks very much as if he was in the non-modernising camp. We know he did do a little bit of work on the St. Lawrence Bottle Works and borrowed money to do it.
But to a bank, this is someone whose assets are falling in value, who needs to borrow money, whose only guarantee is his assets. It's not a good situation.
It's not a good situation.
So he's in a real mess.
Yes.
In the end, Frederick got 6 months in prison. His reputation was in tatters, his businesses were gone, and he had 8 children to support. What's more, it looks like Mary Colbeck moved into Ravensworth Terrace at exactly this time. Because in a local newspaper, I've found a sales listing that shows Mary put her previous home, Walton Hall, up for sale just a few weeks after Frederick's release. She sold everything, from her mahogany bed to the watchdog in its kennel. Mary must have sold up in order to help her daughter Margaret and her family. For Mary, the sale of her home must have represented more than just heartbreak. It was also the end of 2 of her deepest hopes, the hope that her daughter's marriage would end in happiness and prosperity, but also the hope that she herself would be able to enjoy a happy and peaceful retirement. Because the scandal that's engulfed this family is so serious that it's wrecked not just the finances of Frederick and Margaret, it's also dragged in Mary. So setting up home here in Ravensworth Terrace represented the beginning of a new, unwelcome and extremely difficult part of her life. Mary must have taken in her grandson James in order to help her daughter Margaret. But where is Margaret? and the rest of the family. The 1861 census tells us that after Frederick's release from prison, he and Margaret moved to the small market town of Morpeth, 15 miles from Newcastle, presumably to escape the scandal. The street numbers have now changed, but from an old map, we know that this is the house they moved into with their 7 other children. The current owners have let me have a look around. We don't know what income the family had, other than Mary Colbeck's money, as having been made bankrupt, Frederick would no longer be able to trade. But we do know that while living here, Frederick and Margaret had a 9th child, a baby boy. But what remains unclear is whether Mary's help was enough to give the family a new start. We've only been able to find 2 documents to tell us anything about the life the Todds led here in Morpeth. The first is from October 1864, and it's a death certificate. It's the death certificate of Frederick. He's passed away, just 46 years old. He's described here as formerly a bottle manufacturer at Newcastle upon Tyne, and the cause of death is given as diarrhoea. Now that's not uncommon to read that on a Victorian death certificate, but it's much more common when the person who has died is someone poor, someone living in insanitary conditions in a slum. So the fact that this is the cause of death for Frederick might tell us something about his physical state, his health, his mental condition. The second document is from just 3 years later, and again, it's a death certificate. And this is the beginning of an even more tragic story, because this is Margaret's death certificate, and she's died just 41 years old. The local newspaper of 1867 gives us more details, and it makes for very disturbing reading. The coroner's report describes Margaret as a woman who was addicted to what it calls intemperate spirits. It's telling us Margaret was an alcoholic. On the night of her death, she went to bed at 5 p.m, we presume drunk, and then gets up again at 10 p.m, and then she calls for more brandy. Then at some time between 1 and 2 o'clock in the morning, her little daughter, who was in the same bed, very probably right in this room, discovers Margaret to be in flames. She calls a neighbour called Mrs. Dixon, who immediately arrives and finds Margaret sitting on the side of the bed, her clothes a mass of fire. 3 days later, Margaret dies of her injuries. Maybe she knocked over a candle, maybe she was so drunk that her clothes got too close to the fire. We don't know. But this is the latest in a series of tragedies that's befallen the Todd family. But this time, this awful, terrible scene has been witnessed by a 6-year-old girl, Mary Victoria. 8 years after moving into Ravensworth Terrace, Mary Colbeck was faced with nothing less than a catastrophe. After the tragic loss of her daughter, Mary, now aged 72, had another 8 orphaned grandchildren on her hands. And they must have joined James and moved in with her here. But they didn't stay for long, because despite being a wealthy widow, I've found documents that show that Mary quickly sent them away. 2 of the boys are put on a boat to Australia, aged just 17 and 14. Another is sent to become a draper's apprentice. And the next year, the 3 youngest children, including Mary Victoria, are sent to orphanages. It's really difficult to work out what to make of all of this. It looks like by 1871, just one of the children is still living with Mary. Now, there's lots of reasons why she might have sent them away. This is a big house, but maybe not big enough for 9 children. And by this point, Mary herself is in her 70s. It could be that she's just too tired, too old to look after that many children. But there's also the possibility that she sent the children away out of a sense of shame. Of all the scandals that affected the family, losing her daughter so publicly to drink would have been the hardest to bear. In Victorian Britain, female intemperance was regarded as a particularly immoral vice, one that it was believed left a hereditary stain on the drunkard's children, who would now be seen as polluted, damaged goods. So what was Mary up to? I found a document in the National Archives dated 10 months after the fire, and it finally reveals Mary's motives. What it tells us is that she was trying to sell the last of her properties, the 3 farms owned by the family trust. And movingly, on the last page, Mary lists the names of those she wants to benefit from the sale, all 9 of her grandchildren.
What these documents show is that Mary Colbeck wasn't sending these children away to get rid of them. She was sending them away to help them start new lives and begin new professions. And here she's selling valuable family land to try to claw together some money to try to help them begin those new lives. This is a woman doing absolutely everything she can to help her family.
With the money, we know that another 5 of her grandchildren emigrated to Australia and New Zealand. But despite everything she did, she couldn't save all of them. On the 20th of December, 1870, James, the boy Mary had taken in, aged 13, died of consumption in this hotel, the Great Northern Hotel at King's Cross in London. He was just 22. That leaves just one grandchild unaccounted for, Mary Victoria, the little girl who, aged just 6, had witnessed her mother in flames. And her trail has led me hundreds of miles south to Torquay and to a cemetery. Having been sent to an orphanage in Windsor, she contracted typhus and was then sent to Torquay to recover in the sea air. But in 1870, the same year as James, Mary Victoria died, aged just 10. She ended up here, in this unmarked grave.
I had honestly thought that things just couldn't get any more tragic in the story of this family. But of all the Todd Colbeck children, the one who perhaps had the least chance of recovering from what the family had been through, the one that you would have worried for most if you'd known the family, was the little girl who witnessed her mother's death. And what the story of Mary Victoria and the Colbeck family shows you is that even for the rich, life in Victorian Britain was precarious. This was a property-owning, business-owning family. In just 12 disastrous years, the fortune is lost, the children are scattered. And the best you can hope for is that what Mary Colbeck, their grandmother, managed to do for them allowed some of them to build new lives.
Four years later, in 1874, Mary Colbeck died at Ravensworth Terrace, aged 78. By now, the area of Summerhill was beginning to slip down the social scale, as Newcastle's wealthier residents moved away from the growing industries by the Tyne to the more genteel area of Jesmond. Records for the next few years show that numbers 8, 7 and 6 next door become a school for boys. And number 5 becomes home to 11 people, including a laundress, 2 grease merchants and 2 of the school's teachers. But by 1886, number 5 has been taken over by a tenant of a very different kind. This is Kelly's Directory. It's a list of all the businesses in Newcastle, and it's one of the places you would naturally turn to try to find out the name of the next resident of this house. But looking at this edition, which is from 1886, what we find is not the name of the next tenant. What we discover is that this house, along with number 6, number 7 and number 8, are no longer private homes. Instead, they've been incorporated into something called the Diocesan Home for Girls, which is run by Miss F. Atkinson, Lady Superintendent, who doesn't sound like she's going to be much fun. The Diocesan Home was a religious institution set up by Newcastle's first bishop, Ernest Wilberforce, and his wife Emily. Its aim was to rescue what they called vulnerable girls from the city streets and train them for new lives as domestic servants. The annual report for the home in 1886 records 57 girls living on the site. It doesn't list their names, but a later census gives us a glimpse of the kind of girls who ended up here. The census shows 21 girls living in the home, and they're not all from Newcastle. There were girls here from Scotland, from Carlisle, Wolverhampton, Manchester. Now, we haven't been able to find out very much about any of them, apart from one. This girl, Alice Coulson. She's 15 years old, and we've managed to dig up some family records. And what they show is that she is the archetypal vulnerable girl. She's born in a small village 16 miles outside of Newcastle. When she's 5 years old, her mother dies. When she's 12 years old, her father dies. And when she's 14, the last relative who could possibly look after her, her older sister, also dies. She has nowhere else to go other than the home. Increasingly prosperous, Newcastle had just been granted city status. But with its busy port, there was also a rising concern about the growth of the sex trade, in which girls like Alice risked being trafficked into lives of prostitution. Records show that some were as young as 11 years old. Initially opened in 1883, the diocesan home occupied the 3 houses next door. Number 8 was home to the parish workers who rescued girls like Alice off the streets. Number 7 was the training home, where Alice would have spent her days being schooled in domestic service. Number 6 was a receiving house. And by 1886, Number 5 had become a dormitory to cope with the increasing number of girls passing through the home. To understand what life was like here, I'm meeting fellow historian Dr. Fern Riddell. The records for the home here in Ravensworth Terrace have been lost, but do we know much about how these sorts of homes were run?
We do. We have a guide from 1881 from Ellis Hopkins, who was running an association for friendless girls, and it's called Preventative Work for the Care of Our Girls.
Our girls. And does this tell us about what daily life would have been like here?
Very much so. So it would start at kind of 6:30 in the morning. That's when you would get up, and you'd have breakfast around 7:15, 8 a.m. time for prayers, because obviously spiritual instruction in these girls is the most important thing. And then you'd either go to be a day helper at a house, or you'd go to the laundry, or you would go and be trained as a housemaid.
Training girls like Alice to clean and scrub didn't just give them practical skills. The same process, the home hoped, was also happening internally to the girls' souls.
If a little girl insists on being idle and slovenly at her work, the dowdiest hat and the ugliest dress is picked out for her with a disparaging remark, "You are not earning much, you won't work, this is plenty good enough for a lazy girl like you."
That's appalling.
It's brutal.
And it says a little girl.
Yeah, so 11, 13, 14. I think that's one of the most painful parts of this, is that the girls who were here were already judged by society to be at a disadvantage simply for where they came from. You know, it's that old idea of having bad blood in that it could come back. You know, they were at risk for themselves just in who they are.
So although the ambition of these homes is to help these girls, to give them a job, an occupation, to train them for domestic service, get them out of the bad situation they've been in, but while they're in there, it's not a kind environment.
I think it really depends on who's running it. You know, homes like this were built with a desire to better and rescue and save children who were in terrible circumstances. That's never going to be a bad thing, but it really does depend on the motivations of the people once you get inside the door.
The records show that some girls didn't stay the course and that many returned to the worlds they had come from. But this wasn't the case for Alice, the orphan who was taken in at 15. A later census shows that the home found her a job as a housemaid in a villa in Filey, a seaside town on the Yorkshire coast, where she was one of 4 servants looking after a wealthy widower and his children. Digging further, we also know that her time in service was short. Within just 2 years, Alice married a young telegraphist from Nottingham called George Herbert Fletcher. By this time, Filey had become a fashionable seaside destination, so it's not too much of a leap to imagine that Alice met George on her day off, while walking by the sea or in one of the parks. What we do know for certain is that that meeting was life-changing, because the couple not only got married, they went on to have 4 children, and they ended up living in a big 5-room house. So the girl who had been orphaned by the age of 12 and who ended up in the home for girls in our house in Ravensworth Terrace did manage to transform her life. She was able to find some happiness. Number 5 Ravensworth Terrace didn't stay part of the diocesan home for long. After just 2 years, the house returns to being a private home when, in 1887, a new tenant moves in, Bevan Harris. From this document, the 1891 census, we can tell that Bevan Harris was a draper. He's in his mid-60s and he's moved to Newcastle from Hull with his second wife, Elizabeth. Also living with them are 2 of their 11 children. There's Rose, who's 20, and Albert, who's 19, and they're both working in the family drapery business. There's also their granddaughter, Eva, who's 9, and there's 2 lodgers who must have taken rooms up on the top floor of the house. So this is a busy, active household with Bevan Harris as the patriarch. The Harris family would have known the house well. In 1885, Bevan had taken over the shop on the Westcott Road that backs directly onto number 5. From the shop, he ran the family business, selling textiles and fabrics. And 2 years later, the family moved in across the yard at the back, joining the house and the shop together for the first time. Some of the residents have left their mark on the physical fabric of this house. The current owners have always wondered why there's this stone lintel in the middle of a brick wall. Well, if you look at the planning application that Bevan Harris submitted in the 1880s, you can work out that this is the top of the doorway that he had built between what was then his drapery shop and the house. So it was through this doorway and across the yard that the Harris family travelled back and forth between where they worked and where they lived. Bevan Harris might have been running the draper's shop with his family by day, but that's not actually how we find him in the records. Searching for his name in the archives, it turns out that he was a prolific writer to a number of national newspapers. But the publication Bevan contributes to the most is not what you'd expect of a draper from Newcastle. It's called The Two Worlds. In its day, this was one of the most popular magazines promoting the phenomena of spiritualism, the belief in life after death, and in the idea that the living could communicate with the dead or with those who it said were on the other side of the veil. We think Bevan first encountered spiritualism when he was living in America in the 1850s. But what becomes clear is that he became not just any old believer. He was one of British spiritualism's most celebrated evangelists. This is the Two Worlds portrait album of spiritual mediums, workers and celebrities, which, as it says in the preface, is a roll call of the movement's most ardent heroes. And here, on page 45, is Bevan Harris. Now, he's described as an enthusiastic propagandist, an open-air worker, and a versatile writer. While he's not a medium, he is a sincere spiritualist. And there's the picture of him with his full Victorian beard and the open, expressive face of the true convert. By the late 1880s, Newcastle had become one of the strongest centres of working-class spiritualism in Britain. And this might have been why Bevan moved here. And thanks to the Two Worlds, we know that he was often seen preaching on the city's streets, converting people to the cause under a blue and white flag bearing the motto, "There is no death." Alongside his open-air work, Bevan held magic lantern lectures, in which he projected the very latest scientific proof that spirits hovered all around us. Created with double exposures, these so-called spirit photographs had taken off in America during the Civil War of the 1860s. And one of the slides Bevan would have projected was this one, an image that showed Mrs. Lincoln being visited by the spirit of her recently assassinated husband, President Abraham Lincoln. The Two Worlds also tells us that Bevan organised seances at Ravensworth Terrace, in which believers came face to face with the spirits of their dead relatives. Prompted by the death of his 23-year-old daughter Emma, Bevan, in September 1891, held a séance at number 5 with one of the most famous mediums of the age, Mrs. Annie Mellon, who he believed successfully conjured up the spirit of his daughter. And we think it happened in this very room, the drawing room on the first floor. To help me understand how the séance unfolded, I'm joined by experts Roger Luckhurst and Pat Beasley. So the séance that happens in this room, how would it actually have worked?
Right, okay. Well, you'd have had a darkened room like this. In actual fact, it'd probably be even darker than this. And you'd have had a series of chairs. You might have had rows, depending on how many people were here. And then you'd have had a structure in the corner of the room, very much like this. This was fairly typical, where a corner of the room would have been curtained off with heavy drapes like these. And behind there, in this alcove, you'd have had a chair on which the medium would sit. And there's a rope here because she may well have been bound to the chair.
What does that prove if she's tied to the chair?
That shows that Annie Mellon has stayed in the chair. So all of these amazing manifestations that come out from the curtain are not her.
So once Annie Mellon's behind her drapery, she's tied to her chair, the lights have been lowered, then the show begins, I guess.
The curtains would part and out would come the spirit manifestation.
What do you mean when you say manifestation?
Well, she had two spirit controls. Sissy was one of them, and she was a small black child, and she would appear at about that kind of height, in a sort of as a diaphanous white figure. And one of the common features about Sissy was that she liked chocolates, so a member of the audience would offer her a box of chocolates. She would take the chocolates, she would rattle them, and then she would start eating them. And then there was Geordie, or George, who was a tall, thin Scotsman with a dark beard.
Geordie is a little bit more mobile, we think, because Sissy kept very close to the cabinet.
Suspiciously close.
Suspiciously close
one
to
might
the
say.
cabinet, yes.
So Sissy and Geordie are just the warm-up act. And what people have paid for, and paid is an important word, is to meet their husbands or wives or dead children.
Exactly that. We know that Bevan Harris himself was particularly persuaded by Annie Mellon because she produced the spirit of his own departed daughter.
So this is a profound experience, because he really believes this.
Absolutely, yes.
And this is what he's out on the streets of Newcastle preaching to other people, that this can happen, that you can meet the dead again. And now it happens in his own home, with his own daughter, with one of the greatest, most famous mediums in the world.
Absolutely, yes.
Miraculously, photographs of Mrs. Mellon with Geordie and Sissy survive. Taken a few years before the séance at Ravensworth Terrace, for believers like Bevan Harris, these photographs were yet more proof of Mrs. Mellon's extraordinary powers to communicate with the other side.
I know I'm judging by modern standards. I find it really hard to believe anyone looks at that picture and they don't see a woman with a doll.
Well, I think many Victorians did look at that picture and see a doll, but I think if you are predisposed towards this, as Bevan Harris was, then what you see is a spirit.
You have to really want to see. And if that's supposed to be an African child, then she needs to get out more. Because you know, a lot of African children, I used to be one.
Yeah.
I've never met an African child that looks like that. I've seen a lot of dolls that look like that.
You have to be a believer, don't you?
It may seem obvious to us today that séances like these were conjured up with nothing more than some clever theatrics and a bit of bravado. But why Bevan was so drawn to this world becomes clear when you look at the circumstances of his family. All of these documents are death certificates, and all of them are for Bevan Harris's own family. In 1891, the year of the séance, his son, aged 40, dies of abdominal injuries. The same year, his daughter was just 23, and she dies complications after childbirth. Then, in the next year, his wife, Elizabeth, dies of cancer of the throat. She will have died in one of the bedrooms upstairs. Her coffin will have been taken out of that front door. But even before all of this, Harris had suffered other tragedies, and we know about that because he tells us in his own words. This is a letter he sent in to Two Worlds, in which he describes a séance in which he encounters the spirit of another dead son. And that's because back in the 1850s, Harris had been living in America and he had lost his first wife and their baby child. And he describes this mere babe of 18 months old who died and was buried in America 34 years ago. And the spirit, the apparition of this child appears, but now grown into manhood. And Harris says to this spirit, "Are you George Frederick Harris, whose body was laid in a grave in Burlington, New Jersey?" And the apparition says, "Yes, Father." And holding up his hand, he says, "See, I am taller than you now." When Harris wrote that, he was a man who had lost two families, who would bury at least 4 of his children. It is hardly surprising that he was fixated on ideas of life and death and life after death. And in that, he was not unusual for the 19th century. The truth is that in the 1890s, life expectancy in Britain was around 46, and infant mortality accounted for nearly a quarter of all deaths. In fact, death was so present in Victorian life that families were often photographed with their dead relatives and dead children. And for many, it was spiritualism that enabled them to cope with their grief.
This is something that Bevan Harris says in his own words when he's writing about the death of his wife, which had come soon after the death of his daughter and the death of his son before that. He writes, "My dear wife, after suffering with cancer for 6 months, has left me to mourn her loss." This makes 3 deaths in 15 months. Oh, what a blessing is spiritualism under these trying circumstances. In another letter, Harris says that he expects to join his family soon.
In 1894, Bevan Harris moved to Nottingham, where he too passed beyond the veil. And a year later, Number 5 becomes home to a new family, the Orams. They are William Henry, a sea captain in his 40s, his wife Mary Ellen, and their 3 teenage children. In the late 1890s, Newcastle was at the height of its industrial might, and its population had boomed to around 250,000 people. Its shipyards were now building vessels for some of the world's most powerful navies, and fleets of merchant ships left the Tyne every day to carry trade all over the globe. From newspaper reports and photographs, we know that William Henry is a steamship captain, transporting coal as far as New Orleans and the Black Sea. And that Mary Ellen is a dressmaker who was moved into town to grow her business by taking over Bevan Harris's drapery shop on the Westcott Road. To help pay the rent, they also take in 2 lodgers, so this was another busy household.
When the Orams step over the threshold of this house for the first time, it is for them a big step up in the world, because just a few years earlier, Mary Ellen had been living in a house in Tynemouth with her mother, her brother and her 3 children. But now the children were teenagers, William was well established as a sea captain, so moving here is more than just a chance to live in a nice big house in the middle of town. It's a chance to start a new business, because it's here that Mary Ellen is going to secure the future of her family and make something of herself.
To find out whether Mary Ellen realised her dream, I've managed to track down one of her descendants, her great-grandson, Tony Holmes. An ex-teacher, Tony has spent years researching his family history, and he's got a tale to tell.
This is where your great-grandparents actually lived.
Yeah, I'm filling up at the moment. I never dreamed that I would actually be sitting in a house where my ancestors were as well.
What have you found out about Mary Ellen?
She was a seamstress, a dressmaker, a draper. Looking at this photograph, she could well have made those clothes herself.
These are the clothes of somebody who believes they're going somewhere in life.
Yes. Yeah. Her husband, once her husband started to go through the ranks in the merchant navy, he became a master mariner. That is not to be sneezed at. It's a good job to have. And whilst William Henry was away, she was working herself. She was bringing up children. But it seems to me that something went wrong, and but I just do not know what it was. And this is where I...
You okay?
Yeah. I just couldn't believe it. I started to look through the census information, and I looked at the 1901 census information. I suddenly realised she was an inmate in St Nicholas Lunatic Asylum.
And these are her admission notes to the asylum?
Yeah. They called it melancholia. I think she'd had a nervous breakdown.
When Mary Ellen was admitted in 1900, St Nicholas's was Newcastle's first purpose-built paupers' asylum. Here she was one of 700 patients who were being treated for conditions ranging from mania to her condition, melancholia, what we today call depression.
The husband, William Henry, says she talks a way of being without home or money and wishes that she were dead. She dreads that I will leave her. She's tried to drown herself in May.
When it says she's fearful of being without home, we have to presume that that's this house that she's frightened of losing.
Yes, I really do think that's a good assumption to make. And she says here, loss of memory, first symptoms, observed, talks nonsense, was restless. And she imagines her husband's business is bad. Then she said, and this is bugging me, 7 years ago, she invested her husband's savings in a business which failed. And this obviously is pressed heavily on her mind. And they're my ancestors. I've been out of work on occasions. I've been short of money on occasions. And it's deja vu. And I'm thinking, well, hang on, I'm there. I've been there. To go from the lady that she is there, the lovely lady as well, right, to this lady here, I couldn't recognise the two.
To find out what went wrong while the Orams were living at number 5, I've come to the Tyne and Weir archives just down the road. Here, I found a planning application for the building on the Westcott Road. It shows that the landlord was applying to completely rebuild and refit Mary Ellen's shop. Within the planning permission file is this letter from the builder. What it says is that they're going to find it very difficult to finish the refit of the shop until the premises are let. This is from June 1898, and what that means is that the shop is empty at that point. And what that tells us is that Mary Ellen's business failed within just a few years. Mary Ellen clearly struggled to make the leap from being a dressmaker, making clothes at home, to becoming a draper, managing her own shop. But she also opened her business at exactly the wrong time, because the trade was going through a period of significant change. It's a story design historian Professor Deborah Sugg-Ryan knows well.
It was a big step up for Mary Ellen to run a draper's shop, very different from being a dressmaker. She had to deal with stock and the bookkeeping and supply side of the business. She also had to manage her customers as well as her suppliers and create a reputation for the shop as well. And all of this must have been quite a challenge for her, especially at a time when the retail trade was changing very rapidly. In this period, there was a new experience of shopping on offer to women in Newcastle, with the opening of several department stores, the most famous of which was Phoenix. And Phoenix, by the mid-1890s, had become really quite spectacular. The son of the founder, Fred, was sent to Paris to train, and he brought back to Newcastle all the lessons he'd learned from the Bon Marché, the most famous department store in the world. And I think the draper's shop started to feel a bit old-fashioned compared to the experience that was available in the department store. I think it must have been quite difficult for Mary Ellen to compete with these department stores. She might have had to undercut them to get a trade, and she also might have had to think as well about the experience of shopping, maybe paying more attention to her shop window in order to draw ladies into the store.
We don't know what she tried, but clearly it wasn't enough to save the business. And unfortunately, disaster didn't just strike Mary Ellen. I've found documents in the archives that suggest William Henry's career took a terrible turn around the same time. In 1897, William was found guilty of dangerously overloading his ship with coal on his way back to Newcastle from Gibraltar. It was a risk some sea captains took in order to sell extra coal on the side. In his case, this might have been a desperate attempt to shore up Mary Ellen's struggling business. He was fined £20 and lost his job. For the Orams, 1897 is a year of disasters. William Henry loses his job, Mary Ellen's business collapses, and with all of their savings gone, they're forced to leave Ravensworth Terrace. And Mary, who is convinced she has plunged her family into poverty, ends up in the asylum. In the end, Mary Ellen spent 2 years at St Nicholas's Asylum, but in an extraordinary twist of fate, she wasn't the only resident from number 5 to end up there. While looking for her original notes in the archives, what comes next is a bit of a surprise, because I've also found the asylum notes for her husband, William Henry. It turns out that after leaving Mary Ellen in the asylum, William emigrated to Canada to start a new life. But 7 years later, having had a stroke, he was sent back to Newcastle, where his daughter, unable to cope, took him to the asylum. There he died, just 8 months after being admitted. The asylum records of William Henry Oram make pretty depressing reading. He was admitted in 1909. It says that his occupation is ex-master mariner, 61 years old, and his form of insanity is dementia. And this also tells us what his daughter Mary said when she brought him to the asylum. It quotes her words. She says, "I cannot look after him. He will commit suicide. I wish him looked after in the asylum." And the doctors agree. They say he is miserable and that he has a wound on his head that is evidently self-inflicted. He is tired of life because he is blind and paralysed, and he will commit suicide at the first opportunity. And here in the margins is a little photograph of Henry. He's evidently blind, he's staring past the camera, and he really does look like a broken man. What happened to the residents of number 5 Ravensworth Terrace over this period of just 40 years reads like a Victorian melodrama. And it's too easy to forget that these were real people with real lives, not characters in some penny dreadful. And for all of them, this house played an extraordinary role in their stories.
For some residents, number 5 Ravensworth Terrace was a sanctuary. It was the place in which they rebuilt their lives after suffering loss or bereavement. But for others, this house was a poisoned chalice. It was the place in which all of their dreams of a better life fell apart. And that's because for our ancestors, living in an age in which there were few safety nets, a single bad decision, a single stroke of bad luck could set you down a path that could lead to the asylum, or even to a pauper's grave.
In 1907, Ravensworth Terrace is ready for its next resident, Grace Eagle, who runs number 5 as a boarding house. But at the outbreak of war, her family gets caught up in a wave of national hysteria and xenophobia that sees them become victims of a harsh new law. The authorities are clamping down on the activities and the movements of anybody from those enemy countries, Germany and Austria.
His only crime is to be an immigrant from the wrong country.
It's just tragic.